Hi. So let's get right to it because chances are, if I buried this video as number 30 in the list of videos, I don't know how many I'm going to have, but uh, then you have to wade through all these other videos to get to something that's going to be truly useful to you. So let me give you the number one thing that you've got to do in the job interview right away. So we talked about the idea that you have to be the person the hiring manager likes the best. That's the person who gets the offer. So the question is then, how do you go about doing that? Well, when we did the research, and I mentioned that I originally wrote the book not to have any interest in helping people in the job interview, but as a business card handout for a product that a service that we provided in helping companies find that next competitive advantage. And this was a case study. The reason the interview was a good case study is because everybody understood that really well because they had all been through it. Plus, so many people have written about it and worked on it. You know, the likelihood of finding something new seemed pretty remote. That's why we chose it. Of course, we found something new, and it turns out very useful. And so that's the background for the book. At any rate, in the course of our research for doing this book, came across lots of studies around what happens in an interview and how people make judgments. And we know that people make judgments because that's all that this is when it comes down to who's going to get the offer. It's just a judgment call on the part of the hiring manager. So when we talk about how judgments are made, it turns out that we're not very good at being statisticians or being that rational in our judgments. We tend to be very emotional in our decision making. And what affects uh, judgments are things like biases, and we use heuristics to shortcut the decision making process. But biases were a real issue. And we thought, okay, biases are there. Are we going to be able to deal with them? We only have an hour, really, if you think about a typical job interview, in which to work on this stuff. Are we going to be able to address it? And they are insidious, by the way. Biases are very tough, and they can be pretty deep seated. Great example: the symphony orchestra. Years ago, it used to be that when the symphony had an opening for a musician, they would post the job and then they would hold auditions, and a musician would come out on the stage. Typically, there was a panel that would evaluate them, and they would play a piece of music they'd prepared, or maybe a piece of music the conductor perhaps asked them to play. And then the panel would listen to the music and they would make their judgment based on who played the instrument the best. And what happened is an American woman went to an orchestra in Europe to audition. She was probably best in her instrument in the world at the time. Perfect audition. When the callback sheet came out, she was not on the list, and she looks down the list and sees that they're almost all men. Then she did some more research. Turns out that in Europe, particularly, the orchestras were made up almost entirely of men, in some cases entirely of men. She sued them for gender bias. They fought her tooth and nail. She eventually won. It took 2 decades for her to win. But long before that, two parties got interested in this. One was the symphony orchestras themselves. They wanted to be able to avoid getting sued by somebody for gender bias. And then psychologists were interested in how this bias played out. And so they went and they interviewed the psychologists, members of these panels, and asked them, uh, are your decisions biased towards men? And they would say, no, of course not. We only listen to the quality of the music. I says, well, why do you think then that you tend to have a propensity to pick men? And the answer was, well, it's because men are bigger and they're stronger and they have more air and therefore they can play the instrument better, which of course is total nonsense. The other most popular reason was, well, we all know that men play music because of their love of the music. There's a lot of heart when they play the music. Women, they play for technical expertise. There's no heart in the music, and you can hear that. Also, total nonsense. So we know that it's total nonsense because they fixed the problem, and they fixed the problem by creating the blind audition, right? Curtain comes down, and the musician who's auditioning cannot do anything that gives away anything about them. They can't speak or talk and so on. When that happens, guess what? Gender bias goes away. And you'll see that today in orchestras. Most orchestras are at least or very close to half either gender, and certainly getting close to where we need to be in terms of the gender mix when it comes to symphony orchestras. Well, our investigation into bias and perhaps how to handle it led us to a guy named Daniel Kahneman. Now, every psychologist knows Daniel Kahneman. He's the father of behavioral economics, really because he and his partner, Amos Tversky, discovered that the way we make judgments and decisions is not the way economists think that we do or pretend that we do. We actually are very flawed in our decision making. So anyway, they wrote a whole bunch of material around bias, which I read, and then I came across a study that Kahneman had done that led to a theory called the peak end rule. What the theory says essentially is this, is that there are certain human experiences, he calls them episodic experiences, that have a defined beginning, a defined end, and a very consistent middle. And so if you think about lots of experiences are that way. When you start your day, you wake up, you go to sleep, that ends your day. The middle, though, doesn't tend to be very consistent. Lots of variability up and down across your day. But something like a job interview is very episodic in that it does have a defined beginning, a defined end, and a very consistent middle. So we thought, okay, this rule probably applies in that case. What does the rule say? And the rule says this, that the quality of that experience for the participants is determined by the peaks that they experience during the experience and the ending, with the ending being the most important. Now, there actually has created, after the theory came out, some debate around which is more important, the peaks or the ending. But everybody agrees that if you can have a really big peak at the end, that's the power. That's where it really resides. And we thought, okay, great. We want to create a big peak for the hiring manager at the end so the hiring manager will feel like this was really a great experience. This 1 hour I spent talking to this fellow or this woman was a great experience. So how do we do that? Well, at first we thought, well, we'll come up with a great joke that we can tell right at the end, or we'll tell a really moving, emotional story at the end of the interview. But we started to look at research around peaks and how the brain peaks and came up with it that the brain, you can tell the brain is peaking by the activity in the brain. The more active the brain is, the bigger the peak. And how do we know that a brain is active? Well, they do these fMRI studies, which is using magnetic resonance, which measures blood flow. And they use it to determine what parts of the brain are getting the blood, which indicates that part of the brain is functioning during this particular thing that they're examining. Now, the MRI machine, you have to remain very still, but some very clever scientists figured out how to use it even when somebody's talking, how to take that noise out of it so that you can really see what's going on in the brain. And so we knew that we wanted a very active brain. So how do we get a very active brain in the hiring manager? Well, we came across another study that said, that had done this study using the fMRI machine, that said the brain is 4 times more active when we're talking than when we're listening. Interesting, which meant that we had to create this peak while the hiring manager was doing the talking. It wasn't what we were going to do, it was what the hiring manager was going to do that was going to create this big peak. So we thought, how do we go about doing that? Well, it so happened that at the time, as serendipitous as this was, I had come across an old book by Barbara Walters that was for sale in my library. They sell old books every once in a while. And so I bought this little book. It's called How to Talk to Practically Anyone About Practically Anything. And I read this little book. And in it, Barbara Walters was a very gifted interviewer. And in it, she talked about working on the Today Show. And it was earlier in her career, and people didn't know her. She occasionally did a little bit on the Today Show. Now, the Today Show was filmed live out of New York, but they would do offsites in Philadelphia and Boston. And when they did that, they would go the night before because you had to be in the studio at like 4 o'clock in the morning or something. So they would spend the night in the city. But when they were there, they were always invited to cocktail parties, and they would go, and the crowds would gather around the known celebrities, the weatherman, the main host, and so on. And Barbara Walters was free to sort of walk around meet people and talk to them. And she had this great gift of being able to really talk to somebody. And when she would first meet somebody and shake their hand, she would ask them a question like, you know, let me find out something about you. Tell me, what's your hobby? And people would answer, and I use the example of growing tomatoes because I used to grow tomatoes. And you'd say, oh, I love to grow tomatoes. Oh, Barbara Walters would say, oh, I love tomatoes. You must have grown, what's the best tomato you ever grew? And if tomato growing was your hobby, you'll have a best tomato story, probably have 2 or 3 of them. And Barbara Walters would listen and encourage you. Oh, tell me more, right? After a few minutes, she'd glance at her watch, stick out her hand, and shake your hand and says, oh, I'm so glad I met you. I've learned so much. Thank you very much. And she'd step away. And in her book, she says that very often you would hear this person go over to a group because in those cocktail parties, the strangers were the Today Show crew. Everybody else pretty much knew each other. And this person would go to a little group where they know and would say something like, I just met the most interesting woman, even though Barbara Walters had said nothing. Her insight was that we love to talk about ourselves. And if you want any proof of it, and at the time there was no scientific data that we could go to that would really demonstrate this for us. Go to social media. 80% of posts on social media are people talking about themselves. Well, since I wrote the book, about 2 years after I wrote the book, Harvard got very interested in this topic, and they did an fMRI study in which they had people talk about somebody they greatly admired. And when they do that, the blood flow in the brain just lights up, lots of peaks. But when they talk about themselves, the brain really lights up. I mean, it's crazy difference, just showing how much we actually love talking about ourselves. So what you're going to do at the very end of the interview, now this is after you've got all of the housekeeping done, you're about ready to stand up and shake their hand and leave, and you say, you're going to ask one more question. You know, I've really enjoyed talking to you, and I have one more question I'm dying to ask. You must have done some pretty interesting stuff in your career. If you look back over your career, what's the one thing that you've done that you're most proud of? And you just let it sit. About 85% of people will answer this question. And they'll start by talking about something that comes to mind. And as they're telling the story, very often something else comes to their mind about something they've done, and they switch stories. I've had people tell me 3 stories in answer to this question. It can take a couple of minutes, or it can take more than an hour. And the trick is when you go to a job interview, make sure that you have lots of time free after the interview. One, you want to take some notes, which is always a good idea after the interview. But you never know how long they're actually going to go. A really great interview can go way beyond the time it's supposed to go. Anyway, so that's called the peak end question. And that's your first really valuable tip. That is the most important thing to do in a job interview to become the person the hiring manager likes the best, because people love people who are active listeners when they're talking about themselves, and that's you. Anyway, thank you for listening. I do encourage you to get the book. It's available on Amazon, and I will point out, by the way, it's available both new and used. You're in transition. You don't have to buy a new book. You can buy a used book. And I will tell you that when you buy a used book, the author gets absolutely nothing. So if you want to help me out, buy a new book. But I encourage you to take good care of your money. If you can get it cheaper as a used book, get it as a used book. Anyway, thanks for listening.